Hello, everyone, and welcome to Schmidt List. I am your host, Kurt Schmidt, and I am excited to bring you today a very interesting conversation with my good friend Lucy about user research and all the things that go along with it. Now, before you roll your eyes a little bit and think, wow, that sounds very expensive and like a big waste of my time and blah, 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 blah. Well, let me tell you, Lucy's going to show you the light and you're going to understand the importance of it and why it will not only save you time, but save you money. And we're going to talk all about that in just a second. All right, let's get in and chat with Lucy. Lucy, how are you today?
Hi, Kurt.
I am doing fantastic.
Always good to see you.
Good to see you. All right, Lucy. So tell me about the work you do. As I mentioned, so tell me about your journey a bit.
Currently, I'm a user experience consultant at Fathom Consulting. We do business and user experience consulting. Before that, I was a product designer. So that means that I've worn a lot of hats, especially in the digital space, made a lot of products. And even before that, I was a physical product designer. I worked in theater, I did mascots, I did walk around puppets. So I have a broad range of experience. And it all kind of boils down to making things for people that they'll actually use and making sure that there isn't a disconnect between how people use products and services.
Well, it's something that has been important for a very long time. I mean, since software became something that the average consumer started to use. But what I've seen over the last few years is more and more people realizing that, if you go out and start to ask the customers what they're interested in, you might actually get some direction on what you should be doing. But historically, if we look at organizations, there's the famous quote by Henry Ford, which he didn't actually say, which is if I would have asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses instead of me building a car. But it's used repeatedly where there's sort of this empirical design that comes from the top down, right? Of like, well, we need something that does this stuff. And so go and make that thing, and then we'll see if there's a market fit and all those other things for it. But more and more people and the more successful organizations today seem to be taking user research a lot more seriously. So I want to ask you, Lucy, specifically, if maybe I've not classically trained in user experience and user research, and I want to go out and start asking my customers some questions, where do I start?
Sure. Well, start by asking them if they'd recommend their enterprise software to friends and family. That's usually where I would start. I think the way to start is to obviously start talking to people. There are subject matter experts. Hopefully, there's one within your organization that understands the types of people who are using your product. It's starting to identify perhaps prototypes or archetypes of the types of people who might be using your product.
Hmm.
And then it's going out and talking to them. But I think the thing that is important to remember is you're not just capturing the voice of the customer, you're also trying to understand all of the things that influence them outside of using whatever your product is and making sure that you have a theory of what your product is doing, how it impacts them, and then test that theory. So it's not just going out and asking people, well, would you like something that could do this? Well, of course, people will say yes. There's also always the danger of asking people, well, will you use this product that will make sure you eat healthy every day? Of course, they'll say yes, because in our minds, we're always going to do the right thing in the future.
Sure.
So making sure that you're setting parameters. You're not just blindly going out and saying, hey, what do you think of this? It's
Hmm.
not really about gathering opinions. It's about gathering understanding of what this product actually does and making sure that they understand that it will do whatever they want it to do. And also that it doesn't cause additional harm.
Yeah. And I've been seeing you touched on something that I find really interesting, which is looking at the user more holistically than just in the instance that they're using the software. And it harkens back to something I've seen a resurgence of lately is the jobs to be done framework, which is been around for a long time, but for some reason it's the new hot thing again. Just asking people their philosophy and the way they approach things in that narrow moment where they are interacting with the software can really give you the wrong data, right?
If you don't capture how they're actually using it and the environment that people are actually using the
Mm,
product in, if you are creating, say, an app that needs to be used by a population that maybe doesn't have the newest, hottest iPhone, you need to
Mhm.
take that into consideration when you're designing it, when you're developing it, and figuring out what do you need to do to make it so people who don't have the newest iPhone still have a really enjoyable experience using your app. I think
Yeah.
the same can be said even for just let's think about contrast. If you're developing an app or creating something that is supposed to be used outside, that's going to be a very different user experience than an app that might always be in dark mode, for instance. So, understanding even just physically where your users might be, in addition to mentally and all of those other factors that influence people.
Right. And what about competing or other types of apps? Do you also recommend asking them about other apps that they're using? What else are they hiring to do the job that they're trying to do? Because sometimes what I see with these new applications or different things is they're trying to combine multiple sort of use cases into one
Mhm.
area, right? So instead of me having to jump between Teams and Microsoft Word and Excel, for example, maybe there's one super Word app or something that has all those things built into it. So what should I be asking about competitors or, adjacent things? Like what sort of questions should I be asking? Um,
Yeah, and I do think it's important to understand what competitors are doing. It's important to understand what the other products that are maybe adjacent to yours are doing. That's very important, but I think it's also important to make sure that you're not attempting to copy features or attempting to say, well, this is the trend. Everybody says I have to be able to include videos now, so we're going to do videos even though it's a text-based platform. So making sure that even if your users are using products that are similar, or even if your competitors are in a space that's very close, making sure that whatever choices you're making still align with what your business is capable of. I think a lot of times user research provides a lot of information and user experience design provides a lot of balance between what the business can do, what the technical limitations are, as well as what the users want. Because again, you'll end up with faster horses if you just ask people what they want. User research helps define the path forward on that. And insight from your users doesn't necessarily tell you, you must do this because this is what they're using. It tells you how your users are using that product. So maybe you're integrating with other systems in a different way. Or maybe you're
mhm.
providing different pathways for connection between other systems. And it also gives you an idea of what your users are doing on either edge of going in and out of your product.
That makes sense. I like that you talk about, again, in a holistic sense, but there's also some danger in data too. So how do you, Lucy, approach like presenting findings and things once you've done that data? Because again, there's a lot of interpretation that
Mhm.
has to happen, right? When you're compiling all the data and bringing it back, because I've seen in past and not maliciously, but where the research data can be skewed to aim towards a certain conclusion that maybe you had before you even went in. So talk to me about how do you attempt to remove that bias through the process and then in presenting in a way that is something actionable?
Well, and this is where I think it is valuable to bring in somebody with experience doing this testing. And not that people can't, but being aware of your own bias is a difficult skill to acquire. It's also difficult to realize when you have a bias. Oftentimes, I've often worked with people who are subject matter experts in their
Hmm.
product, their service. And when they ask questions and they analyze data, they are automatically going to have a ton of experience that are going to influence how they're pulling out data, which can be a very good thing. But it's also, if you know how long it took to make something, you're probably going to be less likely to just remove something, right? We'll always try to justify work that's already been done. So,
Workarounds and things, right?
yeah, you're like, well, that took 200 hours to develop. We can't just delete it, but it's not providing any value. And it might be a blocker to some of your users, some of the workflows they're attempting to accomplish.
Hmm.
It is really hard to pull out your personal bias. And I think pulling other people into the conversation can be a helpful way of doing that. So if you do have other partners that have a relationship with the business or technical partners, oftentimes pulling in external perspectives will help you kind of check your bias. I've definitely conducted user research sessions where I've invited our clients and our partners in to observe so they can get an idea and start to build that empathetic connection with their users. They're also going to, I love to have a debrief afterwards so they can tell me perhaps all of the reasons why they as a business didn't go down that path. And then we can discuss alternatives based on what our users were telling us. Do you think it's important to talk it out if you need to? And that helps
Yeah.
remove the
No, I
then
like
all
that.
well, I would say then also you're pulling people on board because they're seeing the impact and they're building that empathetic connection with their users and the people who use their products. And so then it's easier to get people on board too if they actually see what people are saying. There's that human connection there.
Yeah, they're building trust in the data that you're collecting even more so before it's even presented, right? Because they were part of the process in some fashion, so they can see how this was. Because again, like research, to your point, if it's done in a black hole, it starts to erode trust over time. And if you don't bring them along for the ride in some fashion, and you just wait after 6 months of research and you present your 60-page deck with all your charts and graphs, it's not going to have the impact you think it does, right?
Right. There's a huge disconnect there. And when people feel like they've had an opportunity to voice their concerns instead of just having information presented to them, I think that will also help people understand. I think the idea of user research isn't necessarily that you must do what the users say. It's to help you make decisions, make informed decisions. And that's just part of that process. It's to find the pathway forward that will, kind of reach that balance between all of the decisions you have to make when you're creating something.
Yeah, well, just like in any part of life, if you make decisions in a vacuum, you are subject to the cognitive bias of the decisions you make. So if the business just makes business decisions that affect features and functionality of software or even your customer journey just in general, that's going to lead to bias. And to your point, if I just do only what the customer asks, that could lead to problems within the business as well. There's got to be a balance, right?
Yeah, and I think it is also important to talk about the difference between getting feedback from your customers and then conducting
Oh
usability
yeah.
research.
Let's talk
Or
about, tell me the difference between going out and saying, do you like using our product versus what would you like to see our product do? They seem like things you would ask in the same context, but it sounds like maybe that's not the best way to pile it together.
right, I think there can be a difference between interest in what people are looking for. So if you want to do that early discovery, kind of throwing something out there and seeing how people respond to it, finding out, is this something you would recommend? There is value there. And there's value there as you continue to use the products and saying, hey, we changed this feature. How has this impacted you? That's gathering opinions. And I think that's really valuable. And I think that if you think about kind of expanding your knowledge about how people use your product, that's that phase where you're soliciting feedback, you're soliciting information. Whereas I think there's another form, which is kind of it tends to be more usability, but it's also kind of contracting and narrowing in on the best path forward. And it's not asking opinions, it's maybe having users test something, go through a workflow in front of you, try to see if they can successfully accomplish a task, and then how they feel about it. There's a hypothesis that you are testing, right? You've come up with something that you think will work based off of all of that feedback that you've
Mm.
gathered. You've heard that your users like X, Y, and Z. So this is what you've created, and now you want to test to see if it actually accomplishes that. And I think that's difference because you have research questions that you're attempting to answer. You have a hypothesis that you're attempting to validate or invalidate. And that's different than soliciting feedback from people.
Yeah, I agree. Because one thing that I've been a proponent of for many years is that, in a lot of the businesses I've been a part of, they will have a business advisory board, right? So other business people or things that come in and advise the business people on different businessy things. And one of the things I've seen very successful is having also a customer advisory board. So maybe it's not just randomly going out and picking people, which you can do still, but you have maybe a go-to group of power users or different things where you're building sort of that rapport with the people that are using this to accomplish their work on a day-to-day basis, where they're feeling even more and more comfortable over time being open and honest with you about the things that are impactful to them, right? Because I'm sure you found in maybe your research things is that, nobody wants to say bad things to a person about something, right? How could I maybe structure my questions in a way that, if I don't have that customer advisory board, but I do want to build that rapport, what's a good way to structure questions in that research where I'm going to get out of it what I'm really hoping for, Lucy?
Yeah, that's a good question. One, you try to remove bias. You try to say things in as plain of language as possible. I do also think it's helpful to frame sometimes those questions around, is it usable? Because if you ask someone what they think of your product, they don't want to hurt your feelings. If you tell them that they need to accomplish a task and they can't do it because of some reason there was a flaw in the workflow or the UI doesn't make sense, they will happily tell you how much they hate it, and what happened and why they got frustrated. And so I think that sometimes just framing it in a way to say, hey, it's okay to be frustrated. I know I personally get irrationally angry when something does something the way I want it to. If, my Google Home doesn't respond to me in a way I want, I get so mad. And that's helpful information for researchers to see. I think just framing it like that helps.
Yeah, it makes sense. Because I do see when the business is running it, a lot of times the questions could be very biased, where they're like, how much do you like our product
Yeah.
on a 1 to 10 scale?
Yeah.
Uh,
How do you that on a 1 to 10 scale? That's kind of a difficult question to ask. If
Right.
you have someone go through the flow, they can tell you how usable it was, and you'll see them. You'll see how they struggle or where things might be easy. I usually ask people to speak aloud as much as possible and tell me what they're thinking. And you can always tell when something is successful or working the way you want it to, because you really have to prod them to talk more, because they'll just do the task. If it makes sense, it matches their mental model of how this product should work. But if there's something that's a blocker, a pain point, something that will really prevent someone from accomplishing what they're attempting to accomplish, they'll tell you.
Right. And again, to your point, if you're structuring your conversation and your questions in a way that creates an atmosphere of, this is you're being very helpful, not criticizing. I think that's really important. And I love that you said, because I do think you need people that are not so close to the product and the service to be able to come in and parse through some of that data. I'm sure, Lucy, in your years and years of experience being a person who doesn't necessarily know how the business works and how the all the applications work, and go in and start to ask questions, that you can really bring some new ways of thinking to an organization, right?
Yeah, that's usually, I like to say that as a UX designer, my skill is in figuring out how people think about what the problem is. I don't have functional expertise in the products I work on. I have expertise in getting people to tell me where they're experiencing pain points, where they're experiencing accelerators as well. My expertise lies in getting people to talk to you about just how they use things and where their frustration is, or where things could be really good.
And I think that research component is really important, because where a lot of businesses might fail is that they do go to features to solve problems, right? They do go to, well, chatbots, AI, shopping cart plugins, or different things that seem to be ways to fix an experience, right? Like, oh, we'll do the buy now button versus add to cart button, and that's fixes our user experience problem for people, because people were complaining about the checkout process or things. And if they invested a little more time in that research up front, that could save them a lot of money later. Back to your point, you just mentioned at the beginning of this, spending 200 hours on a feature that might not add any value. If you would have spent 20 hours asking questions, you probably could have saved all that money realizing that people didn't want that. Maybe they thought it would be great, but they probably wouldn't use it or something, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes the problem is moving from the abstract into the actual physical thing or into the
Mhm.
actual once you get to the point where you're trying to decide where your buttons should go, how your navigation works. Once you get to all of those little teeny tiny details that make up all of the products that we use, it's important to make sure that you can test that because in theory, it's easy to talk about something, but if you can create a prototype and put it in front of people and have them start to interact with it, oftentimes the problems that people experience when using products is that it's not necessarily that the feature was flawed or that the idea wasn't a good idea. It's that there's something preventing them in the details from being able to do what that feature was intended to do. I also don't really like to break down products as features, right? We're looking at how we're influencing how people use your product. We're looking at influencing the outcomes that the people experience when they use your product. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to define a feature because I feel like you kind of run into issues where is navigation a feature? Or is it an inherent part of the app that is kind of, you have to have it. You have to have a way to navigate. Updating your navigation, is that a feature update? Or are you fundamentally changing how your users interact with your product? And so I like to think about, yeah, as you're doing updates or as you're introducing new concepts and ideas, look at the details as early as possible. Get a designer to slap a prototype together and put it in front of users so you can make sure that it's not the navigation doesn't work, it's that they couldn't find the button.
Yeah. Well, I know the easy fix to that. You just put in a lot of coach marks or tooltips, Lucy, just all over.
Not just tools.
Yeah. How would you like a tour? And say an 8-page bubble that come up to show you around the application.
Or even
That
worse,
fixes.
in
Yeah.
business software, we'll train for that. I
Yeah.
love the concept of telling users how to use products. I don't think it will ever be successful.
There's not a lot of instructions that come along with an iPhone, is there? Um,
I've been
and
known the worst kind of user. I open up a product and immediately start using it, and I never do the tutorial.
yeah,
There's so many beautifully designed tutorials out there, and frankly, people aren't using your product to learn how to use it. They're using it so they can accomplish a task, or there's something they want to do with it.
yeah. And that's where, again, like I see companies where they're struggling, where they are adding lots of coach marks or tooltips or chat bots or larger, brighter red help buttons and things, like here's the wiki to try and combat that stuff. Or Loom videos became very, very popular, right? Where you can go and watch a suite of Loom videos on how to accomplish a task. Now,
No, and that's a lot of time and effort that went in that ultimately, if they had asked their users at the beginning, will you watch a video to learn how to do this? They could have gotten information and saved a lot of money by not
yeah.
spending a lot of time producing video.
But our competition does this, so we just do it, right, Lucy?
Yeah, yeah. Just do what the competition does.
Yeah. That's how you stand out.
Mhm.
Okay, so last question I have for you is if I'm thinking about hiring or bringing in a user experience or a user research person, either in a fractional sort of way or a full-time sort of way, like how do I find a good fit for what I'm trying to find? What sort of questions should I be asking that person? What sort of expectations should I have when engaging with those people?
Sure. I mean, you'll want to ask them how they approach problem solving. I think that finding a variety in different methodologies that you can employ to test something. There's a wealth of information out there, and finding somebody who is willing to explore new methods. I would be hesitant to hire somebody who solves or asks questions the same way every single time. Every product is different. Every service is different. That's the whole reason we hire UXers, right? So making sure that there is some type of curiosity around ways to answer a question or ask a question would be my first go-to, and I think the most important thing. And then also, as you're thinking about it yourself, if people aren't quite to that point of hiring a professional, thinking to themselves, is there a different way to solve this? There are a ton of resources out there that I still to this day use. If I have a question and I'm not quite sure how I want to ask it or the best framework to use, I Google it. I look it up in a book. I look up different UX research methodologies, and I look at the ones that might help me get closer to the answer because it could be different every time. It could be A/B testing. It could be card sorting. It could be tree testing. It could be, there's a bunch of alternative ways of asking questions out there. And so making sure that there's a curiosity to figure out the best way to solve that problem is
Yeah, I love
important.
that. Not just I have a hammer and everything looks like a nail sort of approach, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really good advice, Lucy. Well, if I want to get in touch with you and I want to find out more about the work you do, maybe bring you in to help out in my place, how do I find out more about Lucy and where do I find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on my personal website, which is lucillehinton.com. And you can find me at Fathom Consulting. We're always there to offer a wide variety of advice for a wide variety of problems.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I always enjoy our conversation. I always learn so much. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt.
All right.
Nice
Cool, everyone. Well, thanks for taking the time to join me and Lucy today. We'll see you next time.
I'm over the top of it.